So there's nothing more American than a giant replica Sistine Chapel inside of a mall. So this is actually interesting though, because when you go through the actual thing, you don't really get time to stand and look. They kind of shush you through it. So what we did was we went to this thing and got to see most of what's in the ceiling and what's on the walls of the, Michelangelo's paintings. And although obviously the Da Vinci Code is a bunch of goofy nonsense, there actually is a lot of Renaissance Hermetic Neoplatonic stuff that is encoded in there. So there's like a false Da Vinci Code thing, and like there is a legit Da Vinci Code thing that I'm the real Dan Brown that I will give you access to. So when we went, I went and decoded what I could, and it's just really amazing when you contrast this with like the Seventh Council, and you contrast it with, what we teach. The whole ethos is different there when you look at the artwork, and I mean it's impressive in certain ways, but at the same time it's just very bizarre. And so if you take a look at these, you'll see what I mean. Just a couple interesting elements about the Renaissance Hermetic tradition and their view of Scripture and the history of the church. And of course we have like non-canonical Orthodox iconography, but if you notice in the separation of light and darkness, you'll see that there is what appears to be a medallion that's unfinished or half finished, and it is Abraham separating the animals when he offered the sacrifice, and then the theophany passes between them. And this is the separation of light and darkness at the beginning of the world, which represents that separation of judgment between righteous and wicked, between light and darkness. And then over here you have what looks like a chariot, and that is probably the chariot of the sun, the light being the principal source of light, the sun. And it's spoken of even in the Psalms in the ancient world as a chariot that God would ride. In the final judgment, there's some interesting elements that Michelangelo was criticized for all of the booties and the the boobies, and so he actually placed one of the critics here in the fiery depths of hell, being tormented with having his wee bitten by a snake, literally. And then you have these odd situations where, say, Bartholomew sheds his skin because he was a saint that had been flayed. But it's interesting that at the Last Judgment he's there, and perhaps this is a symbol of the importance of the non-importance of the flesh, or the deeds of the flesh and the resurrection, which is kind of bizarre because it's, on the one hand, it's kind of Gnostic, as if the flesh is something that has to be gotten rid of, but yet at the same time we have this very Italian so-called Christ, which again is bizarre because of course Christ isn't an Italian dude. And that's why Orthodox iconography stresses what the Seventh Council teaches, that you can't make up these kinds of imaginary visions of Christ, because Christ has to be who he was according to the Hebrew lineage, to be a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David, etc. But this painting is interesting just because it is packed with a lot of weird symbolism, elements that don't make sense. But the other element that's bizarre is the Sibyls. And so he did actually paint most of the Sibyls, or many of the Sibyls, into the roof of the chapel. So here we have, for example, the Persian Sibyl, and it notes that she was engrossed in her reading, which led her supposedly to withdraw from the material world into the spiritual world, and thereby she was able to, supposedly in the 1st century AD, mentioned by Varro, this one of the 10 Sibyls out of this one is the Erythraean Sibyl, and you notice she's looking at what looks to be some sort of perhaps Hermetic type of text, and then we see a cherub or a baby, or I don't know what this is, some sort of angel doing what looks to be alchemical work. And you can see that this is highly influenced by Neoplatonism and the Hermetic traditions of that period, which the Renaissance papacy had actually fostered and funded. And so you would see them capitalizing on the Sibyls in just this way. Now, I mean, I think many of the Sibyls were real. I think that there is legitimate prophecies. I mean, if Balaam, right, the prophet in Numbers, can prophesy, then of course it would be stand to reason that we could see the same thing with the Sibyls. And I mean, even Virgil's Eclogues famously have predictions of Christ, right? Plato, if you read different dialogues, a lot of people thought there are predictions of Christ in Plato, the wisdom texts of the Deuterocanon. So there's many, many places where Christ is actually prophesied in these kinds of places. But it's fascinating that in the Renaissance period, they're capitalizing on this for a magical, alchemical, and basically heterodox way. Of course, the easiest example of what I'm getting at here is the fact that they have the depiction of God the Father, which is of course totally heterodox because God the Father is not incarnate. And so in Orthodox iconography, especially at the creation, you notice that Christ is always the creator. There's no other image or in Orthodox iconography that's traditional other than the person of the Logos, because he is the visible manifestation and icon of the Father. And so it's totally ridiculous to paint this old man. But you'll notice too that there's no real contact between God the Father and Adam, and this is totally heterodox in terms of Christology and Orthodox view of creation, where you have the personal Logos is the basis and image that man is patterned on. So Adam is actually made in the image of Christ, the pre-incarnate Logos, not in the image of this old dude. This is just another one of the Sibyls. This is the Delphic Sibyl, which of course they always talk about the oracle at Delphi being some sort of huffing of gases like DMT or something coming out of the stones. I don't know if that's true, but this is another one of the famous Sibyls that prophesied Christ, supposedly. Notice here yet again the same issue where we have creation of Eve out of the side of Adam, but not by Christ, right? And so you can see how easily this lends to a Neoplatonic or Gnostic view, where we don't actually know who that creator is. It's this old guy, and the creator who is this old man, as you can see again here, he speaks to us through perhaps many avatars, right? Not just Christ, but this Hermetic view could then easily lend to a kind of Arian or Nestorian perspective, and that's why iconography has to be strictly following the Seventh Council. You can't teach heterodoxy in imagery and icons like these Renaissance Hermetic paintings do. For example, here you have the quote backside of God, where perhaps Michelangelo was relying on the text in Exodus that discusses the backside, but we know as Orthodox that's the energies. It's not literally from behind. It's ridiculous, right? But you see the iconography here is purely pagan, and it lends to that Hermetic alchemical approach.